when a self-assured white police officer, convinced she's above the law, dares to disrespect a celebrated black judge renowned for his unwavering sense of justice. The entire courtroom stands on edge. Yet no one anticipates that his decisive ruling will not only shatter her pride, but also reshape her life forever. But before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We have more inspiring stories coming your way tomorrow. Now, let's begin this incredible journey together. The early sun cast long, golden rays through the towering glass windows of Horizon City's municipal courthouse. It was Monday, and the place buzzed with life. Lawyers clutched their briefcases, journalists whispered among themselves, and curious onlookers gathered in clusters, wondering what might unfold in the upcoming hearings. The air hung heavy with anticipation, weighed down by the hum of hushed voices. Horizon City, with its mix of towering modern structures and historic brick facades, prided itself on fairness and community values. Yet, if you ask the locals, they'd say that day in court felt different from any other. Something electric coursed through the corridors. Everyone knew the reason. Officer Sandra Hill, a white female police officer well known for her arrogance, was to be tried for reckless driving. Word had spread quickly that Judge Gregory King, a highly respected African-American judge famed for his no-nonsense approach, would be presiding. It was a clash many had anticipated. An officer used to deference, facing a judge who believed no one was above the law. Sandra Hill's reputation preceded her. She had never been short on confidence, nor shy about wielding her authority. With light hair slicked back into a tight bun, polished nails, and a crisp uniform, she embodied the image of discipline. Yet her behavior often suggested otherwise. Countless rumors circulated that she had skirted consequences before, always relying on her badge to sidestep accountability. The previous week, Sandra had been charged with running a red light and nearly striking an elderly pedestrian, Daniel Ortiz, 68 and walking with the aid of a cane. Mr. Ortiz had stumbled and broken his wrist while jumping out of the way of Sandra's vehicle. The incident called Sandra's ethics into question. Was this truly an accident, or a willful show of disregard for civilian lives? As the chatter intensified, the courtroom doors swung open. People poured inside, rushing to find seats. Cameras flashed intermittently, capturing every angle, every tense line on the faces of those present. In the front row sat Daniel Ortiz, his right arm supported by a bulky sling, the bandages visible under his rolled-up shirt sleeve. At precisely 8:45, Officer Sandra Hill made her entrance. Her pressed uniform looked immaculate, from the polished badge gleaming on her chest to the shiny black heels that clicked against the polished marble floor. Confidence radiated from her in waves or arrogance, depending on whom you asked. She swept an icy stare over the spectators, as though daring anyone to meet her gaze. Trailing behind her was her attorney, a man in his 40s who seemed flustered and uneasy in her presence. As they approached the defense table, he leaned in and whispered, "Sandra, I'm warning you. Today's not the day to show off. Please be respectful." A faint smirk tugged at the corners of Sandra's mouth. She raised an eyebrow, but offered no reply. The hush that fell over the room was almost palpable, like the calm before a storm. Journalists in the far corner angled their microphones and cameras toward her, eager for even a hint of drama. At 9 o'clock sharp, the side door opened. Judge Gregory King entered. Tall and dignified, he wore a crisp black robe that seemed to absorb the light around him. A close-cut salt and pepper beard framed his solemn face. Known citywide for fairness, he'd earned both respect and wariness among officers unaccustomed to being questioned. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Everyone stood except Sandra. She stood belatedly, letting out a barely concealed sigh of exasperation. Judge King noted the slight, but did not call her out. Yet. He took his seat, his firm gaze briefly scanning the crowd before settling on Officer Hill. She faced him, arms crossed, chin high, practically daring him to challenge her. Anyone watching could feel the tension mounting. Two individuals with strong personalities were about to collide under the solemn watch of the law. Judge King wasted no time. Opening a manila folder, he began in a steady, resonant voice. Officer Sandra Hill, you stand charged with reckless driving, speeding through a red light, and nearly striking a pedestrian, Mr. Daniel Ortiz. As a result of your actions, Mr. Ortiz was hospitalized with a fractured wrist. How do you plead? Sandra let out a short laugh, audible enough to echo in the high-ceilinged room. Not guilty, she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Your Honor, if Mr. Ortiz hadn't stepped out so slowly, none of this would have happened. So, I'm not sure why we're all here. Low murmurs rippled across the gallery. Daniel Ortiz, seated among the spectators, lowered his gaze, though no anger flared in his eyes, only quiet disappointment. Judge King's expression remained unreadable, but the tightness around his jaw hinted at his displeasure. Is that so? The judge replied calmly. Miss Hill, do you understand the severity of these charges and the potential consequences if found guilty? Sandra shrugged. I understand, but it's not like I actually hit him. At that, a wave of astonishment washed across the room. The young interns in the back row exchanged shocked looks, while a few older spectators shook their heads, as though incredulous that a police officer would dismiss an elderly man's injury as inconsequential. Judge King placed his pen neatly on the desk. Very well, then let us proceed with witness statements. He gave a small nod to the bailiff, who promptly opened the door to summon the first witness. The bailiff guided Daniel Ortiz to the witness stand. A soft rustling of clothing accompanied him. His right arm remained in a sling, while faint bruises still marked his knuckles. Despite his injuries, he walked with quiet dignity. The clerk administered the oath, and Daniel took a seat. Mr. Ortiz, Judge King said in a measured tone, please describe, in your own words, what happened on the day in question. Daniel cleared his throat. I was crossing Maple and 3rd on the walk signal. Midway through, I heard a car engine revving. I looked up and saw a police cruiser speeding through a red light. I panicked. I jumped back, lost my footing, and fell. Next thing I know, my wrist felt like it was on fire. While he spoke, Sandra's lips curled in a faint, dismissive smile. She tapped her manicured nails on the defense table, radiating impatience. Daniel continued. I don't remember hearing brakes. Just a horn blaring. Then I was on the ground, and Officer Hill, she just kept on driving. Eventually, a bystander helped me up, and an ambulance came. Sandra leaned forward, sarcasm dripping from every syllable. Sir, do you recall whether you looked both ways before crossing? A silent hush fell over the room. Even her attorney winced at her choice of words. Daniel held her gaze, unwavering. Yes, ma'am, I did. I've lived in Horizon City my entire life. I wouldn't wander into traffic without caution. The judge interjected. Officer Hill, you will have an opportunity to provide your full statement after all witnesses are heard. Let's maintain order. Sandra rolled her eyes but remained silent, crossing her arms once again in defiance. When Daniel Ortiz finished, Judge King asked, Do you have anything else to add, Mr. Ortiz? Daniel shook his head slowly. Only that I hope Officer Hill understands her actions could have cost a life. I truly hope she learns from this. A subdued hush settled over the room. An elderly man's quiet plea for empathy stood in stark contrast to the tension emanating from Sandra Hill's every movement. Judge King turned his attention back to Sandra. You've heard Mr. Ortiz's account. Do you wish to respond at this time? Sandra shrugged, her posture rigid. With all due respect, Your Honor, I disagree with his version. He was moving too slowly. I honked because I thought he might see me and step back. I never intended harm. You do realize, the judge said slowly, that driving through a red light and speeding are offenses that endanger the public, even without striking someone? Sandra pressed her lips together, then responded curtly, I understand the law. I am the law. A collective gasp echoed. A subtle flicker in Judge King's usually composed demeanor suggested her statement had cut close to the bone. For a moment, his eyes narrowed, but he quickly reined in any display of emotion. Indeed, you are an officer, Judge King said, voice steady. But in my courtroom, everyone is subject to the same legal principles, including you, Officer Hill. Witnesses continued to testify. Civilians who saw the near accident, a traffic specialist who confirmed the surveillance footage of the speeding cruiser, and even a medical professional who described Daniel Ortiz's injuries in detail. Each account chipped away at Sandra's dismissive defense. Yet, Sandra never fully lost her air of indifference. After a few hours, Judge King paused to gather the evidence before him. The sound of pages flipping was the only noise in the otherwise silent courtroom. Finally, he spoke. I've weighed the witness statements, the evidence presented, and the defendant's conduct. Officer Sandra Hill, it is the ruling of this court that you are guilty of reckless driving, endangering a pedestrian, and violating traffic signals. Given your lack of remorse and your role as a police officer, a mere fine would not suffice. Murmurs swept the gallery. Some spectators looked relieved, while others appeared anxious, waiting to see what else the judge would say. Judge King continued. Normally, such an offense might lead to jail time. However, I believe that real change can sometimes be achieved through service, reflection, and humility. Therefore, I am sentencing you to 200 hours of community service at the Phoenix Veterans Assistance Center here in Horizon City. You will report there daily, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Upon completion, you will return for a review to assess whether this sentence has served its purpose. A collective hush overtook the room. Then Sandra's attorney gently tugged her sleeve, urging her to remain silent. But Sandra's fury boiled over. She slammed her palms on the defense table. What? You can't do that. I'm an officer, not some criminal who scrubs floors. Judge King's eyes flashed with resolve. This is not a suggestion, Officer Hill. This is the court's decision. If you refuse, I will have no choice but to impose a harsher sentence, potentially including incarceration. For the briefest moment, Sandra's composure cracked. Her eyes flickered with something akin to panic. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the vulnerability vanished. Fine, she spat, voice trembling with rage. But don't think this will change anything. The judge struck his gavel, concluding the session. Court adjourned. 2 days later, Sandra Hill stood outside a weather-worn, single-story building with a sign reading Phoenix Veterans Assistance Center, a place for new beginnings. The walls, once white, showed signs of age, streaked with dust and fading paint. The modest look of the place clashed with Sandra's pride. Tugging at her plain t-shirt, she'd left her uniform at home. She stepped inside, eyes already scanning for shortcomings. The interior smelled of antiseptic, coffee, and the faint aroma of an early lunch. A few men and women, many with visible injuries or prosthetics, sat at simple tables, chatting in low voices or reading newspapers. The mood was neither sad nor joyful, more like a quiet resilience. A middle-aged woman with silver-speckled hair approached Sandra, offering a curt nod. You must be Sandra Hill. I'm Nora Park, the center's director. Let's get your paperwork sorted. Her tone carried no contempt, just professional detachment. Sandra offered a forced smile. Sure. Where do I start? Nora led her to a small office, cluttered with piles of donated clothing, medical supplies, and paperwork. After a terse explanation, she handed Sandra a name badge and motioned toward the main hall. We serve 2 meals a day, breakfast and lunch, to local veterans. We run group therapy sessions, offer job placement assistance, and keep the place orderly. You'll help with cleaning, serving, and any odd jobs that crop up. Sandra's eyes narrowed. So, I'm basically your janitor and waitress? Nora arched an eyebrow. You're here to learn? Officer Hill, the veterans you'll meet have sacrificed a great deal. They deserve respect, and it's up to you to show it. With that, she beckoned Sandra into a drab kitchen, pointing to a stack of aprons. Put one on. You can start by helping prepare lunch. Sandra stared at the apron, a wave of irritation coursing through her. She wanted to argue, but Judge King's warning echoed in her mind. Finally, she exhaled, slipped on the apron, and stepped toward the sink. A broad-shouldered man in his 60s stood at the stove, cracking eggs into a large pan. He turned as Sandra approached, revealing a warm, weathered face. His left leg ended at the knee, replaced by a prosthetic that squeaked when he shifted weight. "Name's Frank Whitman," he said with a welcoming grin. "You must be the new helper. Think you can handle the toast?" Sandra's jaw clenched. "Sure." She rummaged for the bread and dropped slices into the old, battered toaster, trying to ignore Frank's friendly small talk. Despite her best efforts to appear aloof, she found herself glancing at his prosthetic leg, trying to imagine what kind of experiences led him here. "So," Frank continued in an easy tone, "you from around Horizon City?" "Yeah," Sandra replied curtly, hoping he wouldn't press further. But Frank only nodded, as if sensing her boundary. "Cool. The city's changed a lot since I got back from deployment. I remember a time when these streets were wide open." She tried to ignore the pang of guilt that welled up whenever she saw how easily these veterans accepted her presence. Didn't they realize why she was here? Half an hour later, Sandra pushed a squeaky cart through the dining hall, distributing plates of scrambled eggs and toast. The veterans greeted her politely. Some nodded, others voiced a soft thanks. One or two cast lingering stares, picking up on her stony demeanor. At one table, a woman with short, cropped hair and a scar tracing her jawline paused, meeting Sandra's gaze. "Good morning. I'm Ava Reynoso," she said quietly. Sandra forced a smile and placed a plate before her. "Sandra, nice to meet you," she managed, though the words felt hollow. Ava pressed her lips into a thin line, nodding. "I heard you're here for community service. Must not be easy." Sandra bristled. "I'm managing." Ava didn't retort. Her gaze held a mix of curiosity and compassion. "Well, if you ever want to talk, I'm around." That night, as Sandra drove home, she couldn't shake the strange heaviness that lingered. The people she had served lunch to had been welcoming, despite their own struggles. For the first time in weeks, a small voice in her head asked if maybe, just maybe, her perspective needed adjusting. The next few days settled into a routine. Sandra arrived promptly at 8 a.m., though she complained under her breath about the early start. She cleaned tables, stocked supplies, and helped distribute food. Slowly but surely, she found herself learning the veterans' names. Harold, who'd lost his hearing in combat. Melina, dealing with PTSD. Zach, who spent months homeless before finding shelter at the center. One afternoon, Nora directed Sandra to sort canned goods in the back room. Surrounded by towering stacks of green beans, tomato sauce, and soup, Sandra let out a frustrated sigh. "This is ridiculous," she thought. "I'm an officer, not a stockroom worker." As she pushed a heavy box aside, the door squeaked open. Ava Reynoso stepped in. "Need a hand?" she asked calmly. "I guess," Sandra replied. They worked in silence for a few moments. Finally, Ava broke it. "I used to be an officer too." Sandra froze, turning to face Ava. "You were in law enforcement?" "I was a military police officer. Served overseas. When I got injured, I had to leave the service." She tapped the scar on her jaw. Took a while to adjust. A pang of discomfort swelled in Sandra's chest. "Sorry about that," she offered, unsure what else to say. Ava shrugged gently, her expression inscrutable. "No biggie. Just wanted you to know I've been around officers who act invincible. But out here, we all come back down to earth." Those words reverberated in Sandra's mind long after Ava left the stockroom. She realized that she'd always seen herself as above the average citizen. She was the one protecting them, after all. Yet here, in the presence of people who had lost so much, her sense of superiority felt hollow. Sandra's mandated hours ticked by. On her 4th week, she arrived at the center one morning to find a small group of volunteers setting up chairs in the large meeting room. Nora explained that a special guest speaker was coming to talk about road safety in the city. Busy stacking chairs, Sandra looked up when she heard a mild, familiar voice. "Need a hand with that?" She turned, and her heart skipped a beat. There stood Daniel Ortiz, the elderly pedestrian she'd nearly hit, the man whose fractured wrist had started this entire chain of events. He wore a gentle smile, despite the faint scar running along his forearm. His voice carried the same quiet dignity, she remembered from court. "Hello, Officer Hill." Sandra's mind raced. She forced a polite nod. "Mr. Ortiz, what are you doing here?" He lifted his bandaged arm, still in a small brace. "I volunteer at local community events. The center invited me to share my thoughts on pedestrian safety." Sandra swallowed hard. Memories of the day she screeched through that red light flooded back. Shame warmed her cheeks, though she fought to maintain a neutral expression. "I see." An awkward silence followed. Then Daniel quietly picked up a folded chair and began setting it in place. Despite his injury, he moved with remarkable patience. "I never got the chance to thank you," he said softly after a few moments. "Thank me?" Sandra asked, surprised. "For taking your sentence seriously," Daniel explained. "Some people would have refused or found shortcuts. But from what Nora and the others say, you're here every day, doing the work." Sandra opened her mouth, struggling to find the right words. She realized she had no snide comeback for a man who showed her only kindness. Well, I'm just doing what the judge ordered," she said, though her voice wavered with an undercurrent of honesty. Daniel's eyes sparkled with an almost grandfatherly warmth. "Sometimes we start something because we're forced to, but we finish it because we discover it matters." Sandra blinked, a wave of conflicting emotions washing over her. She had no response, only a nod, and she turned back to her tasks, heart strangely unsettled. That evening, Sandra found herself driving home with the radio off, thoughts swirling. She remembered Judge King's admonition about arrogance, the calm resilience of the veterans, and now Daniel Ortiz's unexpectedly gracious attitude. Each seemed to chip away at a defensive wall she'd built around her heart. The next day, when Sandra returned to the center, she greeted the veterans with a nod that was noticeably less hostile. She stepped in to help Ava clean a spill in the hallway without being asked. During lunch, she actually chatted with Frank about sports. Bit by bit, she was letting her guard down. It didn't go unnoticed. Nora gave her an appraising look from afar, and although she offered no outward praise, a hint of approval flickered in her eyes. Ava, too, softened toward Sandra, no longer needing to tiptoe around the tension that had once crackled in the officer's presence. Around the 3-month mark, Sandra had completed half her required hours. She'd learned each veteran's name and story. She'd listened more than she had spoken, absorbing lessons about courage, sacrifice, and humility, words she once threw around but never truly understood. Not every day was smooth sailing. One afternoon, Sandra arrived late, frustrated from traffic. She was supposed to help Frank prepare lunch for a group of disabled veterans. Bursting into the kitchen, she found Frank struggling alone. He was sweating, the pot of soup bubbling dangerously, and the toast burning in the oven. "Why are you so behind?" Sandra snapped, stepping in to turn down the heat on the stove. Frank's good-natured grin vanished. "Because I was expecting your help 15 minutes ago," he replied, no anger in his tone, but plenty of disappointment. "We got folks out there waiting." A flash of guilt washed through Sandra. In her old mindset, she might have barked about how she was on official duty or the law. But here, in the context of community service, she had no excuse. "I'm sorry," she muttered softly, grabbing an apron. "Let's fix this." They moved with rushed efficiency, managing to salvage the meal. Later, as they served the lunch, Frank gave her a small nod of forgiveness. She returned it with a tight smile, silently vowing to do better. The encounter rattled her. How had she arrived at a point where she could apologize so sincerely to someone she once would have ignored? Reflecting on it brought an unexpected sense of relief. Weeks turned into months. Each day, Sandra found herself thinking less about how unfair the sentence was and more about what she could do to truly help. On an afternoon near the end of her service hours, she noticed Daniel Ortiz quietly reading in one corner of the main hall. His wrist brace was gone, though he still rubbed his arm occasionally, summoning an unexpected well of courage. Sandra approached him. "Mr. Ortiz?" He looked up, kindness in his eyes. "Officer Hill. Good to see you." "Please call me Sandra," she said, voice subdued. "I just wanted to say," she paused, swallowing her pride. "I'm sorry. About everything. I never intended to hurt you, but my behavior, my attitude, it was wrong. I didn't care, and I should have. Daniel listened intently, setting down his book. Sandra, I forgave you a long time ago. We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them. A tension she hadn't realized she still carried seemed to melt away. In that moment, standing in the modest hall of the Veterans Center, Sandra felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time, she recognized that apologies weren't about humiliation. They were about responsibility and empathy. By the time Sandra reached her 200th hour, she was almost unrecognizable compared to the brash officer who had once strutted into the center. Though she hadn't become a saint overnight, her once frosty demeanor thawed enough that veterans like Ava, Frank, and others saw in her a genuine ally. She began contributing on her own initiative, organizing a small fundraiser for the center and even contacting local sponsors to donate additional supplies. On her last official day of service, the center held a simple goodbye gathering, offering Sandra a small card signed by the veterans. She opened it to find heartfelt messages. Thank you for your help. Keep doing good out there. Don't forget us. Tears pricked her eyes, an emotion she once would have dismissed. Nora Park stood beside her, arms crossed, a proud tilt to her chin. Officer Hill, or should I say Sandra, she said gently, thank you. These past few months, you've made a difference. I hope you'll continue to visit. Sandra swallowed hard, blinking back tears. I will. I promise. Not long after, Sandra found herself once again climbing the stone steps of the municipal courthouse. Gone was her officer's uniform. This time, she wore civilian clothes, a modest blouse and slacks, and carried a portfolio of documents detailing her community service. The bright morning light felt almost symbolic, as if welcoming her into a new chapter. Inside, the same hush greeted her, but the tension that had accompanied her first trial was notably absent. She made her way to the front of the courtroom, nerves fluttering in her stomach. Judge Gregory King sat at the bench, the same air of solemn authority about him. Officer Sandra Hill, you stand before this court again, having completed your sentence of 200 hours at Phoenix Veterans Assistance Center. We are here to review your progress and determine next steps. How do you wish to address the court? Sandra drew a deep breath. Your Honor, these past months were eye-opening. I went in angry and convinced I was being punished unfairly. But now I realize I was arrogant. I put my pride above others' safety, and I nearly cost a man his life. At the Veterans Center, I learned about sacrifice and humility. I'm truly grateful for the chance to change. A noticeable stillness settled in the courtroom. Judge King watched her intently, as though searching for any trace of falsehood. Finding none, he nodded. Miss Hill, I have followed the reports from the center. Their staff speaks highly of your work and the attitude shift they observed. The court recognizes you have fulfilled your sentence. More importantly, it recognizes that you have gained genuine insight. Sandra felt an unexpected surge of relief. She glanced over her shoulder to see Daniel Ortiz sitting in the gallery, nodding in approval. Nora and a couple of the veterans had come as well, offering silent support. She managed a small smile in their direction. From this point forward, Judge King continued, I trust you will uphold the law with the honor and respect it deserves. Officer Hill, you are free to leave with no further penalties. However, remember that real change isn't about completing hours. It's about how you live your life each day. Sandra lowered her head humbly. Yes, Your Honor. The gavel's strike echoed through the chamber. Once a harsh sound, now a liberating one. Outside, the midday sun bathed the courthouse steps in a bright, warm glow. Sandra emerged, blinking in the light, feeling as though she were stepping into a new reality. Though she could have rushed away, she paused, letting the moment sink in. Daniel Ortiz and Nora Park met her at the base of the steps, each offering a handshake. Congratulations, Nora said simply. You earned this. Thank you, Sandra replied, heartfelt. She paused, the words catching in her throat. I'm sorry for how I acted when we first met, Miss Park. I was, well, you know. Nora's features softened. In understanding. Water under the bridge, she said, patting Sandra on the shoulder. What matters is who you are now. Daniel offered a gentle smile. And if you ever want to volunteer at the center again, we'd love to have you back. Sandra nodded, emotion welling in her eyes. I'd like that very much. Later that week, Sandra decided to do something she wouldn't have considered before her transformation. Revisit the Phoenix Veterans Assistance Center on her own time. She arrived without fanfare, wearing casual clothes and carrying a grocery bag full of fresh fruits. She intended to donate them to the kitchen, perhaps help Frank whip up a healthy dessert for the residents. Stepping inside, she was greeted with surprised smiles. Ava waved her over from one corner. We didn't expect to see you again so soon, she teased lightly. Sandra shrugged, feeling a warmth in her chest she hadn't recognized before. I realized I've got a lot of free time outside my shifts. Figured I could lend a hand. That afternoon, she learned how to cook a stew from scratch, courtesy of Frank's patient guidance. She helped Harold adjust his hearing aids when they malfunctioned. She even shared laughter with Ava about the silly dance moves they both used to love. By the time she left, the sky had turned lavender with dusk, and she felt an unaccustomed feeling of purpose. In the coming months, word quietly spread through Horizon City's police department that Sandra Hill wasn't the same officer she used to be. She approached her patrol duties with newfound caution and empathy. If she stopped a car for speeding, she did so with the intent to educate and keep them safe, not to assert dominance. People in the community noticed. Complaints against her dropped to zero. Occasionally, she'd even greet pedestrians with a friendly wave, including older folks like Daniel Ortiz who still navigated city crosswalks. No one expected Sandra to be perfect overnight, but the slow shift in her reputation spoke louder than any official commendation. She also visited the Veterans Center regularly, sometimes once a week, sometimes more if her schedule allowed. She and Nora collaborated on a small workshop teaching veterans about local job opportunities. She organized a fundraiser through the police department, securing donations for new exercise equipment at the center. Through these actions, Sandra rediscovered the core reason she became a police officer in the first place: to serve and protect, not to dominate and intimidate. In forging relationships with people she once overlooked, she found a deeper sense of satisfaction than she'd ever felt while flaunting her badge. Months after her community service ended, Sandra found herself standing at the intersection of Maple and 3rd, the same spot where she'd nearly struck Daniel Ortiz. The traffic light changed, and a few pedestrians began to cross. She lingered, heart beating a little faster. The memory of that day remained vivid, even painful. Yet, as she watched the light turn red and the cars halt, she felt a newfound appreciation for the simple, everyday structures that keep people safe. She no longer saw the crosswalk as something for others to obey, while she could do as she pleased. Instead, she saw it as part of the shared responsibility that binds a community together. A quiet vow formed in her heart. Never again will I disregard another person's safety. As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed, a text from Ava, reminding her of the weekend potluck at the Veterans Center. She smiled and texted back, "Can't wait. I'll bring dessert." This was perhaps the greatest sign of Sandra Hill's transformation, the subtle ways her priorities had changed. Instead of dreading the center, she embraced it as a place where she continued to learn and grow. Instead of wielding her badge like a shield from responsibility, she wore it as a symbol of genuine service. If you found yourself moved by Sandra's journey, think about how small acts of responsibility and empathy can ripple out, touching lives in ways we may never fully grasp. A single misstep, like speeding through a red light, can cause untold harm, but a single apology, a single day of service, or a single choice to listen instead of judge can set us on a path of redemption. What do you think? Could you learn from Sandra's story and apply its lessons to your own life? Have you witnessed a similar transformation in someone around you? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonated with you, remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more touching, thought-provoking content. Thank you for being here and joining us on this emotional, inspiring journey. May we all strive to keep our eyes open to the lessons life offers, even when they first appear as punishment.